Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the regrettable and avoidable looming debt crisis. Avoidable if we take appropriate and timely steps beginning today and continuing over the next few days. As we continue to work to get our economy out from under a protracted and painful recession and on a more robust path of growth and job creation, not having an agreement to pay our country's bills has severe consequences. Defaulting could mean not only a potential stoppage of Social Security and veterans' benefits checks, but even more worrying than what happens to the bondholders and the middle class is the question of whether this could push us back into not only a severe recession, but a worldwide economic catastrophe. We look across at European governments that are struggling with sovereign debt crises. And I think one of the lessons that we should have learned from the events of 2008 and particularly that fall is that a lack of confidence and a vulnerability in one part of the global financial system can be magnified dramatically because of connections and interrelationships and producing a worldwide crisis. So this is an issue that we have to address. A failure to act would cripple our government almost immediately. In August, if there's not a solution, it is estimated that spending in the economy could contract immediately from anywhere to 40 to 50%. And that means that the U.S. economy would be hit with a loss of about $134 billion, about 10% of GDP for the month of August. And a 10% loss to August's GDP would bring our credit markets to a standstill and could lead to the loss of additional jobs. One of the ironies of this debate is that the proposal by some on the other side to simply not pass a credit limit legislation would be tolerable. In fact, it would be catastrophic. Catastrophic in terms of the very objective that they're urging, controlling the deficit. As people drop out of the labor force, they require more benefits. They are not able, legally or in position, to pay the taxes they're paying as they work. And in addition to that, it's been estimated that for every 1% increase in interest rates, and if we default, interest rates will go up on our treasuries, we will over 10 years accumulate $1.3 trillion in additional deficit. So in one fell swoop, the deficit hawks, who are screaming so loudly today, could put us on an even worse deficit trajectory. We know the job of bringing this budget into alignment is not going to be an easy one. It involves many trade-offs, some of which are likely to be very unpopular. Along with my colleagues who served here in the 1990s under President Clinton, we took some tough votes. There was not one Republican vote in support of us in 1993 and 1994 when we began the process of balancing the budget. It takes time. It takes difficult votes. It was done in the 90s. And as we all know, when President George W. Bush assumed office, we were looking not at massive deficits. We were looking at a potential surplus of trillions of dollars over a 10-year period. But with the programs that he, again, together with his Republican colleagues, embraced, of significant tax cuts, of an expansion of entitlements, Part D Medicare that was not paid for, that was put on the credit card literally, and 2 unfunded wars, we are sitting today with this huge deficit. Frankly, this proposal to raise the deficit limit is very simply paying for what President Bush and Republican Congresses did several years ago. And yet, we find my colleagues on this side saying, oh, we can't do that, or we can't do that without significant reductions in programs that are vital to Americans. We've already demonstrated. We did that in the continuing resolution that's covering this year's funding, that we can and will make difficult cuts. We can reduce spending. But we have to do it in a measured way. And the other thing we have to do is recognize that any solution, just as it was in the 90s, will require revenues as well as expenditures. That is the only way the arithmetic will work. I find it sometimes ironic when I go around and talk and say, oh, you know, if we don't solve this problem, you're putting all of this burden on our grandchildren. Where was that spirit when the president cut taxes and began to eliminate a surplus that would have benefited our grandchildren? Where was that spirit when the president decided to engage in 2 major wars but not pay for them? Where was that spirit when the president decided that he was going to expand entitlements and not pay for them? There were very few of my colleagues on this side worrying about grandchildren then. Well, we do have to worry about our grandchildren. That means we have to start taking the tough steps today. We have to start making the sacrifices that will get our budget in order. And those sacrifices not simply in cutting programs that are so vital, not only to so many Americans, but are so vital to our continued economic growth. I am sure everyone here will say they have important highway projects in their state. They are important infrastructure projects in their states. Do we sacrifice those projects? If we do, then we sacrifice our economic efficiency, we sacrifice our productivity, and guess what? We give the results to our grandchildren: a decrepit infrastructure, inability to be competitive in a very, very competitive global economy. So we have to, I think, move forward. We have to move forward to avoid a catastrophe to the economy if the debt ceiling is not raised, and also move forward to begin to balance our budget in the way it's been done in the past, and frankly, in the way that it only can be done. And that is that we have to start beginning today to make the sacrifices and make the tough choices that will, in fact, provide a better future for our grandchildren. We have done it in the past. In 1993 and 1994, we took tough steps, as I mentioned before, to begin to balance the budget. And in 1997, with a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, we took additional steps. We can do it, and we must do it. Now, the idea that we're going to default is, I think, difficult to imagine. But still, there are those out there on the other side that are saying they will not vote for raising the credit limit in any way, shape, or form. I think that's irresponsible. I think we have to be responsible. We have stood up before. We have taken tough votes. We have to do it again. And failing to do that just puts a huge burden on the middle class. The wealthiest amongst us may be able to negotiate through the vagaries of what might happen after a credit default by the United States. But for Social Security recipients, for military retirees, for those people who are looking for the basic services of government, transit to get to work, the ability to get on a plane, who is going to be manning the TSA post if the government cannot essentially pay its debts? All these issues have to be considered. Now, we have to, as I said, talk about revenues too. It is astounding that people would literally be suggesting that we cut back Social Security benefits, we cut back retirement benefits, we do all these things. At the same time, we're providing about $4 billion in annual tax incentives to the oil industry when the price of oil is at record levels. Their profits are at record levels. These are a host of tax provisions that don't make us any more productive. In fact, one might argue they don't encourage employment here in the United States even. They, in fact, one could make the suggestion at least that the way we set up the system, it might indeed encourage employment overseas and then repatriate the profits here. Well, that might be fine for the big companies and the executives, but what about Americans who are looking for jobs? What about Americans who are looking just to get by? So we also have to recognize that some of the proposals we've made, in fact, all of them, as the President's talked about, with respect to revenues, would not be effective immediately because we are still in a period of very anemic economic growth. They'd be effective in 2013, but they would go to that long-term goal of deficit reduction, which we can achieve. But it will take time, just as it took time in the 1990s. But even these proposals to close loopholes, which are, in my view, very difficult to defend, and to do so not immediately, but several years from now, even these proposals are being resisted by Republicans. That doesn't make sense to me, and I think also doesn't make sense to a growing number of Americans across this country. They want us to be responsible. They want us to be able to pay our debts, and then they want us to get our debts under control. And they recognize that that requires not just goodwill and good wishes, it requires real, difficult choices and sacrifice. We're seeing now an economy that is racking up huge profits for industry. I mean, the S&P 500 index of non-financial members are sitting on about $1.1 trillion in cash. The Federal Reserve indicated similarly that non-financial businesses have about $1.9 trillion in cash, defined as liquid assets. Record profits are being accumulated by corporations. All of this is good, but it's much better if those cash resources and profits are put back into the American economy in terms of creating jobs. And that should be part of our effort, too. Not simply reducing the deficit, reducing it in a way that we grow jobs here in the United States. And that is, I think, at the heart also of what the President is talking about in terms of his efforts. We are on the verge of tough votes and tough choices. And I hope we make those tough choices and tough votes. We do have to pay our debts, I believe, but then we have to get our debts under control. We've done it. We did it in the 90s, and I would argue without some of the policies that were enthusiastically embraced by many here today that are talking to sacrifice for the middle class, but no sacrifice for the very wealthy, we would not be in the same position we are today. So, Mr. President, I believe we're at a very, very critical moment. We have to resolve this issue by August 2nd. I hope we can do that. I hope it will turn on the same kind of sensible, balanced approach that we adopted previously in the 90s. So we have to go ahead and think in terms of restoring our financial house and then getting our American people back to work. And if we do that, I think we will fulfill not only the best hopes and wishes of the American people, but their strong desires.